Senator Warnock.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson described sanctions as an act that does not require force and would not, quote, he said, cost a life outside of the nation boycotted. More than 100 years later, we know that the truth is more complicated than that. We know that this tool, although peaceful, in that it does not rely on the use of guns or bombs, still has severe consequences and can have a devastating effect on societies. In our globalized and connected world, sanctions on one nation usually affect others. Sanctions on a global economy like China, for example, would likely affect folks all around the world. And we know that these effects can last for generations. Ms. Rosenberg, how do you measure the effectiveness of sanctions in targeting decision makers and the ruling groups of nations?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. In measuring effectiveness, I think it's utterly essential to define the objectives against which you're measuring those particular sanctions. So, for example, with respect to our Russia sanctions, we've sought to do two things in particular: to deprive, to deprive Russia of the money and financial funds, and also of the battlefield equipment that it needs in order to fight its war. That is different than saying a goal would be to collapse an entire economy. We're quite focused, and so when evaluating the efficacy of these sanctions, you must measure it against what your goals are in the first instance. Now, one of the reasons why it's useful to have partnership with members of Congress and the administration is so that we can discuss together the goals of various sanctions authorities so that we can be aligned and working with common purpose, and then evaluating their efficacy against the objectives we have set out together.
So a kind of laser focus on the goal so as not to create consequences that cascade beyond what you're trying to do. At the same time, even with that kind of focus, with the world being so connected, there is the concern that this affects poor and working class folks in other countries, particularly with a global economy like China. How do you take all of that into account as you think about this?
Not just those concerns you mentioned, but other ones too that we must all be concerned with, like competitiveness of American businesses and institutions,
Sure.
And our ability to innovate and promote growth in our country, and of course those in our allies. These are exactly the right questions, and I think as sanctions policymakers, we must constantly be asking ourselves every time we implement a new sanction, will this have the desired purpose? Will it have unintended consequences? And seek to mitigate those unintended consequences at every step, before, during, if it occurs afterwards, to try and address them. We do that often using licensing or updating the authority.
Ms. Kindler, can you speak to how you think about this or considerations that you take into account?
Yes, Senator, I agree with your focus on these issues and share your concerns. When we impose export controls, we do so in a very calibrated and targeted way. For example, the advanced computing rule we put in place last October was focused on the most cutting edge of technologies, so as not to disrupt legacy technologies that have limited national security purpose. Our focus was on the cutting edge technologies that would most affect national security because of their use in artificial intelligence and supercomputing.
Thank you so much. We have to carefully consider innocent families and children and those without power when we use these tools, very, very powerful tools. The Commerce Department recently announced a collaboration with the FBI and the Department of Justice, a disruptive technology strike force to target illicit acquisition of technology assets by foreign adversaries like the Chinese government. This seems to follow in the footsteps of the Department of Justice's, quote, China initiative in 2018 to address potential economic espionage. DOJ ended that initiative, as you know, in 2021. Following criticism from civil rights groups that it targeted scientists of Chinese descent. and produced several prosecutions that actually ended in dismissals or acquisitions. As DOJ officials acknowledged, the department heard from members of the scientific community that targeting scientists over sometimes minor research grant infractions could, quote, lead to a chilling atmosphere for scientists and scholars that damages the scientific enterprise in our country. I've been hearing from a lot of folks in my state on this, Georgians of Chinese descent, including scientific researchers at some of our universities, about the climate of fear around any engagement with China, even lawful interaction. Mr. Axelrod, as Commerce begins this new initiative to target espionage by the Chinese government, which is a serious threat, which we have to engage, what steps have you taken to address civil rights concerns and any actual or perceived targeting of scientists of Chinese descent?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator, because you've hit on two critically important things. One is to take action against the threat from the PRC, which is why we've established the Disruptive Technology Strike Force with the Department of Justice. And then a second is to make sure that Chinese Americans or people of Chinese descent who are here studying or working in the United States are not targeted and do not feel targeted. And I believe one thing we've done in that regard, separate from the strike force, which is really more focused on things happening in PRC, is our establishment of an academic outreach initiative. Because in the academic community in particular, it is essential that we both safeguard sensitive research, but also at the same time maintain that open collaborative environment so that we have people from foreign countries coming here to help contribute to the research and development that is sort of the hallmark of our academic setting. And so we've worked, we identified 20 universities in particular that we thought were maybe at higher risk from foreign countries, and we are working with them and partnering with them to what's on really a shared endeavor, which is to protect their research community and protect their research from forces abroad that would seek to obtain it.
I have much more here, but thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Warnock.